So I will have you begin by introducing yourself and stating your affiliation.
Dr. Haten Bazian, UC Berkeley, and Zaytuna College.
Okay, earlier in the summer, you and I were speaking about the situation going on between Palestine and Israel, and you brought up many very important points. And now here we are dealing with another international seemingly crisis. And I just wanted to get your perspective on that. So first of all, what do you make of the kind of abrupt withdrawal from Afghanistan? And then I'd love to talk about some of the blaming the victim rhetoric that we're hearing from our own American president and get your perspective on what needs to be done.
Well, if we think about it abrupt, I think it's about 20 years too late. The United States should not have been in Afghanistan to begin with. I expressed my opposition to the US invasion of Afghanistan right in September 11th or past after September 11th. The United States immediately said that they will be launching offensive operations. And I said what we needed is to send food and support to the Afghan rather than sending them bombs. And it's been 4 presidents that have continued to use Afghanistan for a broader strategy of US global hegemonic footprint. What we need to realize is the United States used the war on terror framing, I put it between 2 quotation marks, to increase its footprint globally, that the United States have carried out offensive or deployment operation in almost 44 different countries since the events of September 11th, and we're going into the 20th anniversary. And the United States have increased or have a military presence in some 77 countries in one way or the other. In this sense. So we cannot really think of Afghanistan as separated from the broader US militarism, military industrial complex, and continued involvement. Now, as why the United States have left, I think both the Trump administration and then followed with Biden, they were trying to get out of a war that it had no end or no objectives specifically internal to Afghanistan. And some would have said that the United States and the Afghan army and government might control the cities in the morning or during the day, but Taliban really ran the country at night. Which means that the strategy that the United States wanted to fulfill in Afghanistan was actually collapsing on a daily basis. Even the US saying that they did not expect or they did not foresee that the Afghan army and the government will collapse immediately. They were actually already saying they were expected it in about 12 months to 16 months, and some said 4 months. Which means that they already knew all along that the Afghan government that they have put in place is not one that had broader support. And here when we talk broader support, meaning that the population across Afghanistan did not have a trust that this government actually will get them into any level of stability, justice, peace, and so on, because it really was built on a combination of corruption, of US machinations. You could also add the opium and the drug dealing. All those were present in there. And lastly, I would say that all along, the United States was not interested in Afghanistan in itself, but rather on its surrounding, meaning how to use the Afghanistan landscape as a balancing act against China and maybe also Russia and Iran. And then you add other players in there, Pakistan and India. So Afghanistan is a territory to be controlled and fought over, not for itself, but for its geostrategic positioning between all these powers. And that has been the dilemma of Afghanistan all the way from the 19th century up to the present. The whole notion of the great game, I call it the permanent great game that is being played around Afghanistan.
And thank you for, correcting me. Right. Right now it seems abrupt, but you're right. We're 2 decades into this occupation. You and I have talked about occupation before, but and we'll get there a little bit too. But I would like to just kind of break down some of the things that we're hearing from Biden right now. For example, he said, we can't stay behind and fight in a war that the Afghan army is not willing to fight. How would you respond to that? And what are the fallacies in that statement?
Well, again, this is the army that they trained. So the big question becomes, what was this army set up in the first place to do? In terms of it is not ready to fight, the question is why? If you have spent 20 years in building such an army, and with the massive training and armament, it raises a question about, again, US imperial training. If you think about Star Wars and the paratroopers and so on, so that raises that question in terms of the army that what they trained. So there's a failure. And again, I'm not in here saying that I think the United States' first mistake is to actually go into Afghanistan, setting that aside as the first mistake. The second question is what type of training they have actually put in place for the Afghan army. Was it being trained to fail, or either trained to continue to funnel massive amount of resources to our military industrial complex? And as such, this operation ran into its eventual consequences, which means a total failure. The third, in terms of saying that the United States is not going to fight in there, I think the United States have thrown everything in its arsenal on Afghanistan, from shock and awe, from the mother of all bombs, bunker busters, during the Obama administration, using every drone capability that basically we were instrumentalizing drone warfare and killing from a distance. All this, in essence, to blame the Afghan is basically to absolve the United States army and military of its own failure. And in essence, they don't want to admit that we have failed. And as such, we are not as invincible as we have constructed ourselves. Again, if you watch Hollywood, you basically, from Rambo all the way up to the presence, you would think that this is an invincible power. And I think what the United States have to admit, that they have reached the limits of the military power to be used in this sense. And I think that's, for me, the response of to Biden is, in essence, he's shifting the blame to basically the rent-a-cop model, that we rented a cop or we trained a military, and the failure is ours, not theirs, even though that they decided or opted to strike a deal themselves with the Taliban, rather than they continue to depend on the United States. Lastly, I would say that also the United States wanted at least to engage in the instrument or the use of private contractors, which is, again, the clean term or the euphemism for mercenaries. And you never can win a war with mercenaries, and going all the way back to maybe the Roman Empire. So that also the United States, the big question has to be asked about the utilization of the mercenaries in this war, and what is their role in also losing the support of the population, which my sense that it was never there, but it was projected that there is support domestically in Afghanistan for US operations.
Okay, we have a lot to unpack. I mean, first of all, in some ways, when I heard Biden making that statement, it sounded like a little bit of white supremacy reasoning, like you ought to be grateful because we've done X, Y, and Z, or like the big brother mentality that the person who was speaking from the Israeli perspective in the last time we spoke. I mean, there's no way to do this other than to speculate, but I'm curious what your take is. Like, I'm wondering why would the Afghan army, why would we assume that the Afghan army was even invested in the same goals? Like, these are Afghan people who would potentially have to fight other Afghan people. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about why we even thought in the first place that they would be interested in carrying out that mission in the long term.
Well, the thing is that when we're only speaking to ourselves. So let's be very clear. The United States is not sitting and speaking. We look ourselves in the mirror and we say we're great. And therefore we have what you call this, Saturday Night Live affirmation of how great we are. But if you believe that, then basically I would say just continue watching Saturday Night Live, and maybe that self-affirmation would be realized. Again, this is a geostrategic game that is being played in the lives of people. Their lives are not counted. Their opinion is not counted. Their understanding of themselves and their own land and their own country and their own territory is not understanding. This is not to say that there isn't contradictions. They have contradictions in Afghanistan, but the United States at no time it itself believed in what it's doing, because literally in about 18 months after the attack, or 2 years after invading Afghanistan, it completely shifted to invading Iraq. So it's even did not believe its own propaganda that they are in Afghanistan to fight the war on terror. They were actually trying to get a geostrategic position, controlling all, dominating all, and try to counter what their perspective in terms of the rising power of China and then Russia. So this notion that blaming the victim, and because they did not believe in our own projected propaganda, again, I would possibly recommend the 12-step program. The first part of it is to actually remove the mirror of self-affirmation, that you look to yourself in the mirror and say how great of a power we are. For me, that would be my response. Now, as far as Afghanistan, again, the United States used the divisions in the Afghan society, which has been present for quite some time, to try to prolong its mission, whether it's dealing with the 14 different ethnic groups in Afghanistan and the various military militias that exist, in order to prolong its presence in the country, but knowing that the exit sign was present from the first day of entry, that you are on borrowed time. And I think the notions that within Afghan discussions that the West might have the watches, but we have the time. And as such, the United States was on its way out, despite thinking that it's there for quote good reasons.
Okay, and then to talk about another piece of propaganda, or something that seems opportunistic in the way that it's used. Right now, we're hearing all about women, right? This is what the Taliban are doing to women. These are all the things that are happening to women. On the other hand, many women have died in US drone strikes. And it feels like a convenient talking piece that we grab onto all the time. And I wonder what if you could give us some perspective, because that is like the vast narrative.
Well, again, if we read Fanon and the Wretched of the Earth, which spoke about the French colonial campaign in Algeria and North Africa, the instrumentalization and the use of the permanent utilization of women and the Muslim women as the site of intervention, that we're intervening to liberate Muslim women from the oppression of Muslim men and the oppression of the brown men. So again, liberating brown women from brown men by bringing in the white man as the savior. And this puts, again, what you call the tension in here, because on the one hand, how do you oppose colonial imperial intervention of Western power while simultaneously addressing the issues that are universal in relations to patriarchy and the oppression that exists? The reason that whether it's Afghanistan or the world, the reason that you have oppression against women is because it's men, not because it's brown men. But in here, the United States immediately shifted to pull out one of the most permanent tools, which is the oppression of women. So we're, in essence, the horrible Taliban or the horrible Afghan, the horrible Iraqi, the horrible Syrians, and so on, that is immediately utilized in order to actually absolve us that we're there for good reasons. In general, colonial discourse always uses these tropes as a way to justify its own intervention and also to wash away its own responsibility for what have transpired. I remind people that when Bush and Cheney began to launch the invasion of Afghanistan, it was framed in the way of liberating Afghan women while simultaneously pushing the war on terror. And I don't know where people are at, but nobody would, in their right mind, would accuse, even as a comedy piece, both Cheney and Bush of being feminists par excellence, while they were domestically curtailing all aspects of women's rights, opposing maternal leave, still opposing equal pay for women, yet they were projected to be in Afghanistan to liberate Afghan women. But simultaneously, I remind people that also Democrats at the time, I remember Senator Boxer from California, she should have known better, being at least exposed to San Francisco and having maybe the fog, which maybe went to fog her own analysis, that she actually called Muslim organizations to see if she could borrow a burqa, which is the Afghan dress, for a press conference about the horrible conditions of women in Afghanistan. So again, the framing of Bush and Cheney at the time that we're there to liberate Afghan women, considering that the framing of only invading Afghanistan for one reason was not sufficient. And also, if you remember, during the Iraq, as Iraq began to be a very difficult terrain for the United States post-2005, rather than saying we're looking for weapons of mass destruction, now we are there to promote freedom, democracy, and freedom of women, even though that in Iraq, women were far more educated, far more in the workforce, far more having their rights during the period than when the United States. So this is a very, very, what you call a slick move. And the media ran to what you call, ran the races. Now they're like maybe trying to compete for the Kentucky Derby of misinformation and projecting now the struggle of the Afghan women is the only way that we are looking through, rather than saying that 20 years of US intervention has basically, while it promoted certain aspects of women's participation, the war itself actually diminishes women, the young, and the society in general, coming on top of another 20 years of US intervention during the Russian-Afghan period. So again, people need to think of the US being there for 40 years rather than 20 years, and because the United States was intimately involved from 1979 onward in Afghanistan in one way or the other.
I appreciate your framing of that as a trope, and are you naming it that, because that seems to be the fitting word. And I do think you could probably do some Saturday Night Live comedy with your framing around Bush perhaps not being a feminist. You're right.
But you could actually take it even when in Egypt, for example, Lord Cromer in Egypt. He was projected in Egypt. He was the governor of Egypt during the British colonial presence in colonial nomination of Egypt beginning in 1882 onward. So Cromer was promoting the liberation of Egyptian women, right? Projecting himself to be that he wants to do this for the Egyptian women. This is at a time where simultaneously he was actually either the vice chair or the chair of the Anti-Women Emancipation Committee or League in the UK. So he was opposing white women emancipation in London and in the UK, while simultaneously projecting himself as the liberator of brown women in Egypt. I think that same colonial dynamic that we see with Lord Cromer is right now could be described of Lord Biden in relations to how immediately shifted into thinking that the Afghans are basically need to be rescued, and that this is meaning Afghan women to be rescued, and the only way is for the United States might and muscle is the only way for us to think of it. And this is without discounting that the women in Afghanistan will face another horrific cycle. So again, we don't want to be in a sense that we're absolving one side in order for us to clean another side. That war itself, colonial war, imperial war, hegemonic war, it actually always structured around the instrumentalization of the role of the woman in particular. And you could see how both masculinity and militarism tend to actually construct a whole discourse on the women. Even the language we use often in imperial discourse is actually try to feminize the society that we're attempting to intervene. And this gets us into the whole notion of Orientalism and Edward Said's framing. Again, that the colonial Orientalist object, that we're the masculine, they're the feminine. And in feminizing the Oriental scope, we tend to also project the women as the site of our intervention. And I think we're seeing this in a very clear way as events unfold.
Okay, and we will talk a little bit about kind of the real struggles that Afghan women and people in general might face from your perspective. But just to kind of close on this point, I think you're demonstrating this with so many examples, but just to remind, like, these same leaders in this country, political leaders, are doing this work to liberate, I am saying it in air quotes, women, or using them as a trope, while women in the United States by no means are liberated, right? The violence against women, domestic violence.
We still have not passed the equal rights legislation, equal pay, again, depending on which economic figures you actually say, whether it's 71 cents or 81 cents on each dollar. We had to fight tooth and nail to get maternity leave in terms of society. We still think that, women as co-participants in the society are not really considered equally or treated in an equal way. Our HR policies is still blame the victim domestically in many of issues in terms of sexual harassment, sexual rape cases, and so on. We still blame the victim, even though that the Me Too movement have maybe moved the needle one notch. It definitely did not go around at the 360 or 180 degree to shift profoundly how we see the society and what it actually transpires on a daily basis.
Thank you. So to move ahead to the Afghanistan that is now, that will be, I don't know, maybe we'll get to a post-US Afghanistan. Right now it seems like chaos. What do you think will become of Afghanistan right now? And then we can talk about like some of the populations and how they might, what it might look like. But what are you thinking will become of Afghanistan from your vantage point at this moment?
Well, it's too early to determine what will the outcome be. But the fact that we don't have a political arrangement or an agreement ahead of time, but by all the Afghan participants in Afghanistan, puts for me a big question marks. In the sense, are we seeing another cycle of the great game that is going to be played in Afghanistan? The reason I say this, that in 1988-89 period, when the Russians withdrew from Afghanistan, all the participants at the time almost agreed to keep Afghanistan in a state of instability. So in here would be that stability by means of chaos to the surrounding players. So the agreement at the time had the United States, had Russia, had Pakistan, had Iran in discussing the exit of the Russians, while at the time the various military forces or military oppositions and the Mujahideen, which had a number of factions, were actually not included in the conversation. And then we had a long period that extended from 88, 89 to 95, almost a 10-year or 7-8-year period of chaos that then saw the rise of the Taliban from the support of Pakistan at the time, and resulting in this period. My sense at the time that the United States also was involved to see if the Taliban could be used as a balancing toward Iran. And initially, when the Taliban took power, they immediately almost went to ratchet up the tension with Iran, taking some Iranian diplomats hostage, and both Iran and Afghanistan had troops at the border. So we were this far away from an actual confrontation between Iran and Taliban, which, if we think of it from a containment strategy, containment, again, George Kennan, wherever is possible, to deploy the resources of your opposition toward another enemy, and therefore you deplete their resources. So that would have been a possibility. So the fact that we don't have a resolved outcome right now, aside from that the Taliban have taken power, but just yesterday and the day before, we already are seeing some oppositions in different parts of the country, military opposition beginning to launch attacks, including from the supporters of, I think, the son of Masoud, Shah Masoud. His son is already engaged in operations. I would expect that some other factions from various areas will begin to launch. So in this sense, the regional powers that are there might still play Afghanistan as part of the great game. So rather than focus on the immediate, my sense is to focus on what are the players that are there, what are the geostrategic questions that are at hand? I do think that the questions of the China's road, that the reigniting of the Silk Trade route that China has been working is at the center part of it. So China will be playing some type of a role in there. The Russians are immediately trying to develop their relationship with the Taliban, and whether that's going to be maintained or not, we'll see. Pakistan is actually seeing the change in Afghanistan as a positive, because India was far more closer to Ghani's government, and they saw that India's role in Afghanistan was weakening Pakistan's role regionally. So in this sense, India's seeing its role diminished might also try to play, since it's trying to project a much more regional hegemonic power vis-a-vis Pakistan. And then Iran, aside from Pakistan, will also likewise would like to keep Taliban at bay and not allow an emerging Sunni militant group in Afghanistan that would ignite a Shia-Sunni war that will shift the line of confrontation from the current Middle East into a confrontations in Southeast Asia, and thus remove or weaken Iranian position. If you think there is an ongoing protracted war with Iran in Yemen, in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, and if another front will be opened in Afghanistan-Iran border, you could see this as a broader containment strategy and shifting and redeploying the resources. So these are, for me, the big questions to think about Afghanistan. While domestically, I think we're going to go into a very chaotic period. Both you're going to have a massive exit, if it's already underway, of the constituted elite of the past 20 plus years. So you're going to have a massive brain drain, massive technical know-how, bureaucratic know-how, all that is going to take place, which is going to create an entrenchment domestically that might actually sharpen the restrictions that will be imposed on whether it's their civil human rights, whether society's broader affairs. And I think women and children will often be receiving the short end of the sticks on a domestic, considering all the forces that are at play. So that's what I'm really thinking that will develop within the next few months.
Okay, so I really wanted all this framework to get in place before we kind of honed in on what might really be at play for the civil layer of society and for women and children. So, of course, we don't have a crystal ball. We can't know for sure. But what are some of the concerns that you have that these populations will face? And then we could talk about how what would be a better way to support other than war intervention?
Well, I do think that immediately, as we are witnessing, the Taliban, in terms of their imposing, they're going to impose their own understanding and their own version of what they consider to be Islamic law, which is really navigating Islamic law on a tribal understanding versus what we call maybe a more in tune Islamic law that is far more dynamic and inclusive. The Taliban are definitely a Hanafi. They at least take their Islamic law from the Hanafi school of jurisprudence. So they're not by any means a Salafi, right? So in terms of Salafi, the Islamic law of Saudi Arabia, but within the Hanafi school, there are elements that are very, very restrictive, and there are elements that are very wide and are inclusive. So in this sense, operating out of both fear and also an anti-Western and a rightly anti-Western perspective. So again, we're not going to absolve the Western intervention, where the West made their intervention in the affairs of society in such a way to westernize the society rather than, quote, modernize. And that's a whole debate whether modernization and westernization are one and the same. In this sense, within Afghanistan, modernization meant westernization, meaning to replicate the particular norms and particular ideas that the Western society wanted to implement in relations to Afghanistan. So in a reactionary mode, both from the period of 1995 to now, that the reactionary mode is to actually almost go counter to what Western notions that were implemented. And in a sense, if the West says take off the hijab, the response to it is put on the hijab. So it's actually in both cases in here, it's both the imposition and the reaction to it, in essence, becomes instrumentalizing the role of women and their place in the society becomes the contested item, which is interesting, again, because I do work on Islamophobia. France is saying to Muslim women, you need to take off the hijab in order for you to be in civil society, and you actually get to be fined if you are wearing the hijab. While in Afghanistan, the Taliban say, you can't come into a civil society without wearing the hijab. In both cases, we see in here is a whole modern Western nationalist project at contestation. So I think within Afghanistan, that would be for us to worry about that notions of what is it that is being implemented. We're already seeing the restrictions on women being in civil society, restrictions of women education, restrictions on women being able to go outside of the home alone. All these from normative Islamic law is just really cannot be supported. But in a protracted conflict and war, where the role of the woman has been put at the center stage of westernization project and colonization imperialist project, now the reaction is producing the same. Both are wrong, but again, this is where we are at and how to actually extricate ourselves while not playing into the Orientalist colonial imaginary, where again, we're thinking of Saeed's imagined geographies, that we're thinking of Afghanistan as part of imagined geography. As soon as you cross the border, that you are into the pre-modern world. That itself is the problem, because modernization has been shaped around westernization, that there's only one model for it to fit. And as such, in a society that has been in 40 years protracted war from outside imposed on it, that the reactions is in essence coming out as a result of this dynamics. And I don't know whether we will be able to come out of it in a short period or it's going to be a long period.
That is a very helpful analysis. And I mean, I think it gives examples of the way that you said that, issues with the oppression of women aren't particular to brown men. They're an issue with men and masculinity globally. And this is just an example of the universality of women being used as a trope.
Sure, it's one of the most easiest tropes that is to be used, both internally and externally, because again, you posit yourself as the defender of the precious values of society, which often is projected on women, while women is completely debased on a regular basis within the society.
Right. And just because we're talking about Islamophobia, I do want to, and for the sake of our listeners, I do want to, of course, underscore the point that most Muslim women will say the hijab is beside the point. If they'd like to wear the hijab, they can do that, and they'd like to decide for themselves whether or not that is.
Again, one has to place that discussions about the hijab in its historical place. Western colonization made the hijab as a central trope for the civilization, the civilizational project of civilizing the barbarians. And Islam itself was a central trope to say that what you have is too much Islam in your DNA. And what we need is to beat it out of you. And if you die in the process, it's like chemotherapy. We were actually intending good to you. So that's basically, if you think about, again, for those who read Fanon, they need to read Fanon with the glasses that his work was focused on Algeria, a Muslim country that France wanted to beat Islam out of the Algerians in order for them to enter into what you call not a true French, but what you call a francophone, a privileged French colleagues, but not truly French. And in order to do that, the women had to take off the hijab. The Muslim men have to also go through a whole transformation, take out their beard. Arabic language have to be extracted from them. So in the same way, that project did not stop. And the Muslim women, the role of a Muslim woman and the whole Western imaginary of it continues to be operable. And therefore, both in public political and in the political discourses and the public discourses. And I think what we need is to go back to Edward Said, latent Orientalism, manifest Orientalism. Latent Orientalism is all the things that we have deposited in our mind. What we have is this firm belief that Muslim women are oppressed because Muslim men oppress them. And while Western women are oppressed, is basically we are not responsible. White men are basically the next thing to apple pie and ice cream, even though every 3 minutes a woman in the West gets raped, every few seconds somebody gets assaulted, right? All that gets to be wiped out. It's all for good intentions, because we are the pinnacle of civilization, while everyone else is basically still going through the stages of civilization. And then you could reduce it to biological racism. In essence, really, they cannot come out of their biological predicament because their DNA or their brain size have not yet developed. So you actually move from Orientalism, cultural racism, Islamophobia into really the continuation of biological racism, that if you scratch of it, you will actually see the biological racism still there. And that's the Clash of Civilization of Huntington is basically using cultural racism as a signpost for biological racism. And you scratch behind every cultural racist, you'll get a biological racism. That's, for me, what is occurring.
Right. And with the white supremacy so vast that people can't necessarily even see that that's what's happening.
Well, again, it's very difficult for them to look at the mirror and see other than themselves. They say, I'm great. That's white supremacy on steroids, and that's what we have. And just think about all of this debate that people are having these days about critical race theory, right? And again, this is another trope that is being used, preparing for the 2022 election, 2024 election, and use a trope, right? And if you think that it must be that America and Western Europe, they're all are reading so much racism that we are post-racist societies, right? And, here we have, Martin Luther King Day. Why aren't you happy about it, right? And, we're going to celebrate or at least recognize the burning of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the Black Wall Street. So we recognize it. What else do you want? Can we get along? What else you want to, you want us to have reparation, right? That's just too much. I'm not responsible for the fact that you are still in this predicament. It's basically, and then we project the problem on the victim. It must be black and black violence. It must be single mother household. It must be, proclivity to violence, to crime. All these are, again, the tropes that are already deployed in order for us not to address the question head on. So everybody is running again to the Kentucky Derby for races on critical race theory without actually confronting race at any given point in its reality and what it means.
Okay, so so this is big. I mean, of course, I just want to ask you, how do we fix white supremacy? But you mentioned the 12-step program, so we just need to get some buy-in for that. But in the meantime,
well, first we have to take the first step, which is that we have a problem. Most people don't think we have a problem, right? So that's we have a long way to go.
just not, I mean, this is tangential, but yet so interconnected, so not so tangential. I mean, how do we get people to take that first step?
Well, first is to say that you're not as great as you think. Meaning, like, put yourself in a real size in terms of understanding what is taking place. That we have some accountability to take, and accounting for history does not mean that individual responsibility can be absolved. So we have to actually take a very clear look. South Africa had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Where is our Truth and Reconciliation Commission? The fact that we had what you call integrated baseball is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's a far, we still nostalgically look back, but we have not yet addressed all the elements. The fact that we just recently, people became aware of the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre. How many Native American massacres we're still not accounted for? How many of massacres and killing of the Chinese during the Chinese Exclusionary Act period, attacks on Chinese encampments that took place, whether it's in LA, where the Chinese that had been killed, and I think 21 or 23 of them. If you think about the Wyoming, the attacks on Chinese, all that is not accounted for. So in essence, saying, can't we all get along? Yes, we can, but some can get along more than others. If you have all the chips on your side and you continue to send more of brown and black subjects to prison than to send them to universities, then the problem has not ended. So we need to confront this in a serious way. And I don't think anybody, including what you call the Biden administration, is interested to confront this, because they're looking at the next election. And the cycle of election prevents people from wanting to take seriously the issues that are at hand.
And to take that first step of really being able to recognize that you're not the center of the world, the very critical race theory that you're talking about seems like a preface to that, and that explains why there's so much pushback, perhaps.
Yeah, again, if we want to be honest with ourselves, we are in a epistemic world. Every meaning in the world passes through Eurocentric understanding. So the self itself is defined around the Eurocentric self. Philosophy itself is defined around the Eurocentric European self, right? So when we think, say, philosophy, we're talking about philosophy constructed as a white Christian universal, rather than being a white Christian particular, right? So that whole notion is there. So every subject, the definition of human and human rights is defined around the universality of the white subject. And we are not ready to actually think that we are in a world that is insists on multi-epistemologies, multi-understanding, and to create the conversations that we have. Just recently, if we think about the destructions that have, right, we're here in California, and the destruction has been visited. We're talking about and complaining about the wildfires, right? And people are beginning to think, well, how did the Native Americans actually live 10,000 years and managed in a very more advanced way than possibly Elon Musk attempted to go to Mars, that they managed this ecosystem in a codependent way without having to result in the destruction, the complete loss of habitat, the fires, droughts that are there. And now people are beginning to say, oh, we need to go back and look at what the indigenous populations have done, right? And including using marshlands to create vegetations, plants, and so on down in Mexico and other places. So this raises the question, is that since we have committed epistemic genocide on the ways of knowing of indigenous population here, but also ways of knowing of the Afghan population. So we're speaking about Afghanistan, right? We want to force the Afghans to think from a Eurocentric epistemological lens, and we're going to beat it into them. And if they resist in whichever way, we blame them for the fact that they don't want to see the world in the same way that we see it, as a white, Anglo-Saxon, hegemonic settler, Eurocentric European. And that's the only way that the world should be seen, can be seen, and would be related to. And I think that's the main challenge at this particular time. And don't let those who are advertising down in what you call that we have reached such a level of advancement that we believe that we bypassed race, bypassed hegemonic control, and continues to really eliminate ways of knowing that might address some of the collective human conditions that we are facing.
Okay, and this question is speculative, of course, but what would be the thoughtful way to move forward? And maybe I should say what would have been, but here we are. What could healing and moving forward look like for Afghanistan, and what would international support look like?
I would say that Afghanistan might, do well if we just keep the external governments and external powers from intervening. I think what we need, we have the notion of timeout. I think the United States should have a timeout. Boris Johnson in the UK should have a timeout. Pakistan, India, Russia, China, Iran should all have timeout and give the ability of the Afghans to try to resolve and address some of the issues that are at hand. That does not mean that letting them resolve those issues does not mean to accept those issues that we are seeing problematic. The fact that Afghanistan has always been the site of the great game, which is to control it for other than itself, meaning the British and the Russians, in order to try to control hegemonically their own territory, they agreed to have Afghanistan as a neutral territory. The neutral territory, meaning that the conflict could be fought in there while maintaining the Russians and the British at the time were in India, in essence, keeping their own territories, their own trade, their own resources at the flow without having to worry. So in essence, it's a proxy war, a territory where that neutrality did not mean peaceful coexistence or peaceful normative practices. So I would say that time out for the global community would be needed to try to support as much as possible the needs of the society. I think the figure I saw that almost $2 trillion have been spent on the US-Afghan intervention, which means that $2 trillion went to the military-industrial complex. So let's just be, I saw that one person said if you invested $10,000 in the military-industrial complex in 2001, it would now have become $100,000. So it's basically 10x investment. So the business of war is business. And in essence, this was how the Afghan war, and I would say the Iraq war, between both of them, $7 trillion have been shaken out of the pocket of the middle class and the poor and went into the rich. So it's one of the most dynamic way of shifting resources. So again, what we need is to see where that has taken place. So what I would possibly think is what is the possible mechanism? I know that the Afghan have this concept of loya jirga, which is the tribal gatherings that will take place. And the United States, over its period of occupation, wanted to instrumentalize and to shape that discussion rather than allowing that discussion to take place. So for me, is really for us, can we hold ourselves and take ourselves out of the equation so we would not be, again, pushing for continued conflict in Afghanistan. This is a country that has been, the population has been at war for 40 years plus, 78 to 79 until now, in constant permanent war, civil war, invasions from outside, invasions from the surrounding countries, interventions, and so on. It is really one of the societies that has been used and abused for so many years. So what I want for us is to actually really give them the ability to see if they could resolve without immediately jumping to instrumentalize another cycle of a civil war, which most likely, as far as I am seeing, it is a possibility that is there, because all the external players still want to play. And Afghanistan is that landscape for protracted intervention to occur either directly or indirectly as a proxy war. So it's very difficult to say, but this is for me what would has let them resolve their issues while maintaining your own standards of what our expectation. And again, from me, it's both studying Islamophobia as being also involved in the Muslim community, there are certain standards that we actually should highlight: the rights of women, the right of children, the right of society to function. All these are not in contradiction. You could both be a critic or critique of what has taken place while allowing people the time and the space to resolve their own internal issues with diversity. This is a diverse society, structurally 14 different ethnic groups. It's also diverse in terms of its history, its heritage, its religious differences in there. You have a large Shia population as well in the east, in the western part. You have a small minority of Christians, you have a small minority of Buddhists. So again, these are the things that we need to think about in terms of principles while facilitating or having the space for them to resolve their conflicts.
Okay, that's helpful. And so it sounds like autonomy would be the first choice. And then when you're speaking about some of the groups that you would like to hold accountable in terms of the oppression that some people might experience under the Taliban, the dream would be that eventually the society would find a way to advocate for those changes on their own.
That's our hope. Again, what is the period for transition? It's very important. I think that the transition period should be thought of and should be structured. How that structure need to come about is still very difficult to say. I do think that all the major players are still attempting to have a role and to play externally, which raises the question, can we really get a real transition in the society? The fact that we're going to have a massive flight is also very, very difficult and problematic, because you're going to really lose a whole strata of intelligentsia in the society. Even if you think some of it is problematic because it was instrumentalized by the United States. But again, whenever you lose that 100,000, 30 to 100,000 that were responsible for running the society, for being in the universities, for education, and so on, you are structurally diminishing the society and its ability to resolve its contradictions. And this is also thinking, is there going to be any what you call setting accounts and people taking their own conflicts that existed prior and trying to resolve it because all of a sudden they are in power and they could extract revenge. All that is going to be part of this dynamic in the next few months, and it's going to be a very messy transition. Lastly, again, I would also think that within the Taliban, there are different factions that also might turn on each other as well. And most revolutions, most political change that occurs in any polity, that the first you have a collective enemy, but then after that, you actually try to see which will be the leading component of that collectivity that came. So we'll have to watch and see if there is any of these fractures that also will emerge as a result of this change that took place in a short period of time.
Super helpful. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up today?
What I would say, just for me, is just for people to be critical but not Islamophobic in thinking and approaching the questions of both Afghanistan, Taliban, and so on. That it is a very easy slipping slope to reactivate our Orientalist, latent Islamophobic mindset and immediately begin to think in these cultural racist tropes and instrumentalize it and begin to blame the victim, the fact that they've been victimized, and then resort to this, what you call the white supremacist, cultural, racist clash of civilization, which is always ready to be activated. So I would ask people to be very critical, be very deliberate in terms of their understanding without having to go down the path of this Islamophobic Orientalist path, which seems to be that's the mass freeway that is always available. And it's the fallback position for many.
Okay, so I am going to give you one final thing to comment on that note before you go. So the act of being critical and not Islamophobic sounds particularly important. What can everyday Americans do to be allies to Afghani people, as well as maybe just Muslims who are feeling a little bit vulnerable right now? Some of them who I've spoken with are certainly feeling that way.
Well, there's definitely vulnerability. I think if you are able to assist, there's definitely a massive humanitarian need. Again, I don't know the exact figures, but somewhere between 30 to possibly 100,000 Afghans that are right now going to be refugees. Some of them will come to the United States. We already are receiving some out in Virginia. I know here in the Bay Area, we're getting some that are coming. So there will be a massive humanitarian need that is immediate. So there's help in there to take. And I think there are going to be in a short period, our political leadership is going to use it as a football in the same way that during the Vietnamese lift, where we had Vietnamese that were part of support for the United States. Initially, they were accepted, and then it became a football game between the political actors, and that is going to come out in a short period of time. So we have to, as Americans, looking from a humanitarian lens, not to allow these policies and these debates to percolate and begin to shape our discourse. If you just recall, the Trump campaign instrumentalized the anti-Syrian refugee crisis. I would possibly think that that might also develop if people think that there are points to be registered and elections to be had. So there will be that part. So the humanitarian, the immediate concern, the larger question is, again, for us to insist on a political settlement that does not involve continued US, European, NATO interventions in the affairs of Afghanistan and in what is occurring. I know that we are in a period where every problem is immediately shifted into securitization, into intervention, into military power. And I think what we need is to insist that this should not be the scope or the approach to engage with Afghanistan again, that we have dropped enough bombs, we have killed enough people, we have wasted massive resources, and the Afghans are not better off as a result of this, and therefore we should at least insist on not going down that path again. And I know we're speaking in still a militarized, interventionist, military industrial complex wired into our system domestically, but that does not mean that we should not insist on a different path going forward. So I would say for Americans who want to help is to make sure that when you call and you talk to your representative, that you insist on a non-military, non-interventionist approach in relations to helping Afghanistan moving forward. So I think that should be a way for us. Lastly, I would say that maybe it's, even though that we're attempting to get the news, is basically to tune the news out. There's no breaking news of CNN. Actually, there's much more of breaking news possibly these days in the comedy arena than rather in the real news, because news is becoming increasingly an info entertainment nonstop. And often we bring opinionated individuals that are coming from the military industrial complex. We go into a military general and then go to a retired military general and then go to a military general or a military person in Afghanistan. In this sense, we're actually getting the view of the military industrial complex on the mess that they have caused. And we're asking them what is the solution for the mess they caused. This is basically is just like a vicious closed circle. So I will actually ask people to possibly pursue a different way and a different approach to seeking information and material outside of the breaking news cycle, because I don't think is anything other recycling the continued framing of military industrial complex that continue to have a dominant role in our media enterprise. 6 companies control 90% of all the information that we actually see, use, consume, and we tend to replicate the opinions that they present to us. So I think shutting off that and maybe picking a book, as long as it's not the Clash of Civilization type of book or Bernard Lewis or some of those, I would say pick up Edward Said, Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi, and some other individuals, actually for you to have a different perspective on what is taking place.
And of course, you can listen to KPFA or Democracy Now!
Absolutely. I'm not including you in the 90%. So that's the 10% that is still have what you call an area of free flow information and some critical analysis that is occurring.
Okay, well, Dr. Haten Bazian, thank you so much for doing this interview today.
You're welcome.
Have a great day.
You too.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.